This is part 6 of the presentation of Understanding Islam, Unpacking the Shahada. And we're looking at the lawful deception, the use of deception in Islam. In the previous part, I spoke about how there can be misunderstandings arising from translation involving Islamic sources. But there is also a permission to deceive that's built into the heart of Islamic teaching, and it is based upon the example of Muhammad. There's a doctrine called taqiyya, which is deception as a form of prevention of harm for the Muslim community. The key verse is chapter 3, verse 28. Let not the believers take for friends or helpers, guardians that's sometimes translated, people that have some care for you or will help you and protect you, unbelievers rather than believers. So don't make friends of non-Muslims. If any do that, in nothing will there be any help from Allah, except if you do it by way of precaution, that you may guard yourselves from them. That word guard has the same, is the same concept as taqiyya. But Allah cautions you to remember Him, for the final goal is to Allah. So what's this saying is that Muslims should not look for help or sponsorship, protection from non-Muslims, except to protect themselves. And this is understood to refer to situations where Muslims are in a minority, where they are vulnerable and they're dependent on non-Muslims for their health, for their well-being and their protection. So a typical example would be in the West, where Muslims are in a minority. They need the protection of Muslims. This is not preferred, this is not allowed really, but Allah will allow them to do that when they need it for precautionary reasons to protect themselves. And interestingly, this verse is one reason why Muslims might behave differently in a situation where they're in the minority than when they're in the majority. In the majority, where they don't need to be protected, the clear teaching is they should not befriend non-Muslims. But when they're in a minority, Allah permits them to, as a way of precaution, to protect themselves. What's particularly interesting is the commentaries on this passage and some of the ways this passage has been interpreted in the commentators. Ibn Kathir said in his commentary on this verse, and you can look this up for yourself, believers are not allowed to show friendship to disbelievers outwardly. Believers are allowed to show friendship to the disbelievers outwardly, but never inwardly. So they're meant to pretend friendship, but not to feel it. Abu Adarda said, we smile in the faces of some people, although our hearts curse them. Al-Hasan said, the tuqya, that is taqiyya, is allowed until the day of resurrection. So this deception will continue until the last day. As-Samakhshari said, the heart is comforted by enmity and hatefulness. So you're pretending to be a friend to non-Muslims who are guarding you, and that's very distressing because you shouldn't be friendly with them, but it's okay because you'll be comforted by the hatred you have in your heart. These are quite confronting texts to be examining, aren't they? They're really, you know, how can that work? What sort of psychological effect do these teachings have? And I want to emphasize that not all Muslims think like this or work like this. Many Muslims are quite sincere in the way they relate to non-Muslims. But the religion encourages otherwise. The religion says, be incredibly friendly to your non-Muslim neighbour, but you'll feel okay because you'll hate them. And how does that work? How do you get comforted by hatred? People that have come out of Islam, and particularly kind of more strict forms of it, or where Muslims are in a strongly dominant position, they understand this principle and they've seen it at work. And it's hard for them sometimes to explain to non-Muslims. When they do that, non-Muslims don't believe them, and they think, oh, this can't be true. How can ethical behaviour look like this? But this is ethical behaviour. This is the straight path of Allah. It creates lots of problems for understanding. And how can you develop genuine understanding of someone else if they're relating out of this worldview? Now, praise God, as I said, not every person relates like this, and many ordinary Muslims don't live this way. You know, your conscience tells you otherwise. Your conscience might tell you this is not the way to live. It's just that this is what Islam teaches. Here is another explanation of this. Al-Ghazali was a very prominent scholar of Islam, and he's well known for his philosophical approach, and he systematized this teaching about lying. And he said, lying is sometimes permissible for a given interest, scholars having established criteria defining what types of it are lawful. Speaking is a means to achieve objectives. If a praiseworthy aim is attainable through both telling the truth and lying, it's unlawful to accomplish it through lying because there's no need to lie. But when it's possible to achieve such an aim by lying but not by telling the truth, it's permissible to lie if obtaining the goal is permissible, and obligatory to lie if the goal is obligatory. So the end determines whether lying is permissible or obligatory or not. He said one should compare the bad consequences entailed by lying to those entailed by telling the truth. And if the consequences of telling the truth are more damaging, one is entitled to lie. That's from The Reliance of the Traveller in discussions, quite elaborate discussions under sections on lying, permissible lying, exaggerating, and giving a misleading impression. It's generally better to give a misleading impression. A misleading impression is literally true, but is intended to make someone misunderstand. So let me give you an example. An example that's given in The Reliance of the Traveller is, suppose someone comes to your house and they want to speak to Ali, and they think that Ali might be in the house. So they say, is Ali in the house? And you know that Ali doesn't want to meet this person. So you say, Ali is not here. Ali's not here. By which you mean he's not here, it's not between my hands. And that person thinks you're saying he's not in the house. So that's giving a misleading impression. That's regarded as more precautionary. That is, if you do sin by lying, you've protected yourself by doing that. And often in relating to Muslim people who are indoctrinated in this aspect of Islam, you have to be very specific in the questions and not just fill in the blanks. There was a case of the Grand Mufti in Australia who gave a very inflammatory speech, translated to English, didn't look good. And his spokesperson said, oh, it's not an accurate translation. Meaning not every word was completely accurately translated, and that was true. But the things that were offensive were accurately translated. But he gave the impression that there was something wrong with the translation, and the person listening filled in the blanks, you know. So that's a good example of those sorts of interactions. You can't just fill in the blanks sometimes. Lawful deception is a specific example of a deeper ethical issue in Islam, that the end justifies the means. Necessity permits what is forbidden. Islam, in one sense, is an incredibly flexible religion, so that you can come up with principles to get around just about anything. Yusuf al-Qaradawi has written a lot about the jurisprudence of balancing necessities. So you've got competing outcomes, so you do the thing that's the greatest value to the Muslim community. Now let me give you an example. Muslims are supposed to fast during Ramadan. They're not supposed to eat and drink from dawn to dusk. And last year the Olympics was held in the middle of the northern summer in the UK. And that's very bad for the athletes because they wouldn't be able to eat or drink during the day. So a number of different scholars came up with justifications about why it was permitted for them to eat or drink. They appealed to principles in Islamic law to justify that. And so there were various fatwas produced to allow them to participate. The reason being is that it's good for the glory of the Muslim community if Muslim athletes can do well and participate. It's damaging to Islam. So necessity permits what is forbidden. It is illegal in Islam to kill yourself, but if your goal is to destroy the enemy, it's permitted. It's not suicide anymore. And there's many, many examples that you could give of that. You're supposed to pray 5 times a day, but if you're traveling, there's an exemption. You can catch up your prayer later on. So this is balancing necessities. Incredible pragmatism is part of Islam, and that can make it quite confusing as well. Some more examples. Pope Benedict's Regensburg address, he said, he spoke of Muhammad's command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. And there was a lot of anger from the Muslim world, and a letter was written called the Aman letter, which rebuked the Pope. It said that the notion that Muslims are commanded to spread their faith by the sword doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, one of the signatories of that was Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who is a senior jurist from Pakistan. And he had elsewhere written that aggressive jihad is lawful even today. Its justification cannot be veiled only because peace-loving inventors of atom bombs and hydrogen bombs call it expansionism. We should venerate this expansionism with complete self-confidence. What he's saying is it's a Muslim's prerogative to conquer the world. How dare you say we can't do that? And he is saying to the Pope, this idea that Islam was spread by the sword is false. And one leading Christian theologian read that letter and said, oh, Muslims don't support using violence to spread Islam. He was taken in by that line. Jihad is claimed to be an internal struggle. The greater jihad is against yourself, only defensive, spiritual. Military is the lesser jihad. This is emphasized. This is, again, a kind of deception, really. The lesser jihad hadith tradition is unsound. In hadith collections, the book of jihad is always about war. It's not about self-improvement. Commentaries on the Quran interpret jihad in the path of Allah as warfare. Several chapters of the Quran are named after aspects of warfare like the booty or the trench. Textbooks on jihad will be military manuals. In Sharia textbooks, the jihad chapter is about warfare, not psychological growth. And they could go on and on. It's a good example of something misleading. This next illustration is of someone who collated two texts by Azam Tamimi. He's from the UK, and he was speaking in two different occasions, one with American Public Radio and another time a fiery street speech. And the radio announcer stitched those two together so you get a contrast of the different voices with which he speaks, and we'll play it.
Do you think that there is significant support in the British Muslim community for using violence to express opposition to British policies?
Not at all. The majority of Muslims are absolutely opposed to the use of violence. It's illegitimate, it's not acceptable. But no Muslim individual or Muslim group has total authority over the minds and the hearts of every single individual in a community like this. We have a responsibility to explain this to our youngsters, that they cannot resort to force.
And we say we are willing to bring it to an end peacefully. But if they don't want peace, we have another language. We have another language. And we have every right to use that language. And time will tell, and history will tell. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Oh, that was the end of that session, actually, so we'll stop there.